Janice has asked me to chair the meeting because I've been a bit involved with this project as the Learning and Teaching Coordinator. But we decided to dedicate the entire meeting to the College Research Teaching Links project, which took place last year. And I don't know whether many of you have heard of it, but it started off by the King's Learning Institute presenting the project to the Learning and Teaching Coordinators and asking them to recruit a student researcher from each of their schools. So I brought the idea back to the School of Medicine and we advertised, and we had 17 applicants for this post, and after a rigorous selection session between Professor Reimer and myself and Richard Phillips, we selected John Wickenden. Where are John? There we are. Yes, who became our researcher. So I let go of the project at that point, and we appointed a mentor for John, who's Diana Kelly, who unfortunately can't come today. And she mentored him through it with the King's Learning Institute. It was then Ian Kinchin, member of staff, who took control of the project, supported by Professor Paul Blackmore, who's I'm very pleased has been able to come. And the project progressed, and we're going to present that today. So we're going to start off with Michael Flavin from King's Learning Institute. Michael, he's going to start off by presenting the background to the project, what we expected to get out of it, and how each school can benefit from the results of the project. Then we're going to move on to John, who's going to present the results of his interviews of staff and what his findings were within the School of Medicine. Then I'm going to present what the GMC has specified in Tomorrow's Doctors that should be included in the core curriculum on scientific principles and basis of disease. And then I'm going to look at what we actually do in the School of Medicine. Following that, we're going to have a discussion, open it up for discussion as to whether we think we're doing enough in the School of Medicine along research principles. So, and then after that, we move next door to have drink alcoholic drinks or squash and nibbles and to network and chat. Okay, so first we'll start with Michael. Oh, Paul, you're going to? All right, come through then. Paul's been director of the King's Learning Institute since 2007 and came to us from Warwick, but has a special interest, don't you, in professional development. Yes. Okay. So there's the...
Do I need to do something?
You just clip it to your front. Okay. Well, like the BBC newsreader or your pocket.
Thank you. Right, and just check that this works.
The session is being filmed.
Oh my goodness, no pressure there then. Okay.
That's the one.
But there we are. Oh, hello everybody. I presume you can hear me. I assume you can. Really pleased to be here, and sorry I wasn't sure whether I was able to be here because I had a meeting called that competed with this one, but I'm delighted to move that across a bit and to be able to be here, because this I think is a really important topic, which I've just called research and teaching. I try to avoid the discussion of research teaching links, because it implies that the two things are separate. And I would argue that we shouldn't be linking them because they should never be separated in our minds in the first place. And my rather simple down-home argument is that research and teaching are both forms of learning, which is startlingly obvious. And the danger that we have in universities is we tend to think of academic learning, or what academic staff do as learning, as being different from what students do as learning, and that how professionals know things is rather different from how we teach students to know things. And that's a worrying difference. Actually, medicine's a good deal better than most disciplines and professional groupings for understanding the importance of translating professional understanding into undergraduate and postgraduate curricula. But there's still often a big gap. And hence, I prefer not to think about research and teaching as being different at all. So the kinds of questions that interest me, because my role is to try to help to improve the quality of teaching wherever I am, is to what extent does research inform our teaching, and to think about what, I'll use the word, linkages might there be, and what are the costs and benefits of doing that? Because as soon as you start thinking about making learning more research-like, it raises a host of issues, some of which are resourcing issues. And how might you make sure that there are effective links? I thought I'd start off with the negative. This is Cardinal Newman. one of the foremost thinkers on education in the 19th century, widely revered in his time and later. And this is very an interesting quote from a book called The Idea of a University, which I tried to borrow from the University of Warwick 10, 12 years ago, and they said, I'm ever so sorry, it's in the vault. So I thought, if you know a little about Warwick, the idea of a university is buried in a vault has a certain resonance. But anyway, that's the notion that the two things are rather different and the one drives out the other. And I suspect if you think of them as very different activities, that's the kind of lived experience of a number of staff. I don't have time for this because I'm trying to do that. And it's partly because we think of them as rather different activities. I've just got a couple of slides here about the student voice, because if you ask students what they think is the benefit of being in a research-rich environment, they come up with a range of different answers. And I've just taken 3 quotes from a study that I did some years ago, not here. And these are the positive ones. Students do like being taught by people who are well respected in their field. Good that you know really up-to-date stuff, quite cool seeing articles and stuff written by people in the department. There's that sense of a buzz and yeah, you're at the cutting edge and you're where new stuff is being done. You also get a very negative side. And I could have shown you lots of others of people saying, the reason I know there's research going on here is that I can never find my supervisor or whatever. And we all know, incidentally, I think, amazing men who are theoretically here. Everybody can name somebody, I suspect. So that's just by way of saying there can be a really good side and there can be a really bad side. And I suspect in most institutions you've got both of these things. Here's a couple of, I think, quite interesting quotes. Carnegie Foundation issued something in the States called the Boyer Report in 1998. And they looked at research-intensive institutions, the Ivy League institutions, and came up with this rather damning indictment, more or less saying that if universities were second-hand car salesmen, they'd be in the dock, because they're offering something that actually students weren't getting. And this had quite a resonance in a very cost-conscious and fees-based higher education system. So people were being promised one experience and actually weren't getting anything like that experience. And here's another little, I think, useful thing from a visit that was an inspection visit that was paid to the University of Exeter, that the precise relationship of the link had not been addressed in any concerted way. And that's my simple claim. There's a lot of argument, you know, is there a link between research and teaching? Does one inform the other and so on? And how much does it? I would start from the very simple position. There could well be a beneficial link, and if we think about it and support it, it's likely to be a stronger link, as it were. It's, you know, if we make an effort to check on it and think about it and improve it, it's likely to be better. So that thereby circumventing some of the arguments about it. What is, I think, useful is this little bit of research from, it's a very famous study by Hattie and Marsh, who New Zealand researchers. I heard them once referred to as Hattie and Jakes. This is from Carry On Researching, you know the film. They did a meta-study of all the empirical studies that people had done to try to show there was a link between high-quality research and high-quality teaching. And somewhat disturbingly, they came up with this conclusion that most of the empirical studies, and I think they looked at about 58 empirical studies, showed there was little or no relationship, particularly in the areas where most people shout loudest about the link between research and teaching, in the natural sciences, in research-intensive in universities, where it's axiomatic, you know, that, of course, if you give us more money for research, we will teach better. Take our research funding away, it will endanger our teaching. No proof of that whatsoever. There are some low correlations, but in the social sciences and in colleges or liberal arts institutions in the States. So that's what appears to come out of these findings. Now, that's not to say that there can't be a very effective sort of cross-fertilization between the two, but it is saying that it's not automatic, really. So that's what the best bit of meta-research has said about this. Why would we bother to think about research in relation to teaching? The arguments usually fall into these areas, that it's really quite motivating for students to be inspired by experts in their field, and that's reported again and again when people do studies of what students think. And then there's the active learning argument, that passively sitting there listening to something, as you are now, is not the best way in the long term of developing your knowledge base, that actually the more actively you're engaged in your learning, the more effectively you will learn. And then there's the skills development argument, that many of the skills that we have as researchers are extremely valuable skills that can be made available to students. So there are sort of very, very good, if you like, educational reasons why you would want to look at research and think, well, how can it inform teaching? Now, this, I think, is, on the face of it, a most unhelpful diagram, I suspect, but if I explain it, I hope it will become more useful. When people talk about the link between research and teaching, they often talk right past each other, because they're actually thinking about different ways of conceptualizing research and teaching, and how the one can inform the other. And this is drawn from a publication I was involved in some years ago, where we did quite an extensive review of senior, very successful academics' views of how they saw research and teaching, and they came up with a number of different ways of thinking about the relationship between them, which are sort of represented in that diagram. And I think two of the important ones are between outcomes and process, by which I mean the outcomes thing is I research something and I feed it into the gullet of the nearest undergraduate, as it were. It's the notion of research as content that I have learned, I am at the cutting edge, I pass it on. And if you don't have much more of a discussion about it, most discussions about research and teaching tend to be about that, which is a not very developed, I suspect, conception of what research and teaching might be about. The outcomes, so that's the outcomes argument. The process argument is research is a process of learning, undergraduate or postgraduate study are processes of learning, and if we think about the research process and get students learning in the most research-like way possible, then that's a very different and much more powerful connection between research and teaching that can be very, very widespread in an institution. There's another argument which is about making the tools of research available to students. That's much easier now, I think, with the advent of the web than was the case 10, 15 years ago. But a really interesting one is the cultural one, which is signalled by context there. And I'll give you a for instance. We went to a department which thought a lot of its research. I mean, everybody thought it was a very good research department, and we asked its first and second year undergraduates the question, how do you know that you are in a research-rich environment? And their answer was, are we? They didn't know. They had no conception, really, of the kind of research that was going on, the depth or the quality of it. All they knew was their academic staff were not always available to them. And so we make assumptions that these things are known and understood, and they're not necessarily. But there is a sort of cultural component. You know, there's all sorts of visual cues around being in a research-active environment as to what people talk about, what's on the walls, you know, what people customarily do with their time. So there's the cultural side of it as well. It's not just these other things. I think this is yours. I'll hand over to you.
Shall I introduce you, Michael?
That'd be pleasant.
That's all right. Michael Flavin is head of Curriculum Innovation in King's Learning Institute, and he's the main coordinator of the King's Experience Project, which is a college-wide project to ensure a good education at King's. Not only that it's excellent, but distinctive as well. He's also told me he was writing up his second doctorate, which is on technology-enhanced learning, so clearly into learning.
Thank you. Paul's given us a broadly theoretised introduction into links between research and teaching. So just in a small number of slides, what I want to do is narrow the focus of that and look at research-teaching links in the context of King's, and then narrow the focus even more to look at research-teaching links in the context of medicine at King's. As Helen mentioned, Paul and I are both involved in a large project under the banner heading of King's Experience, where what we're aiming to do is see that education at King's is not only excellent, we believe it is already, but distinctively so. So in terms of specific actions we're taking, we're starting to produce guidance notes for individual curriculum characteristics. So we can urge for greater integration of research and teaching, but at some stage we have to start offering practical suggestions on how those linkages can be brought explicitly to the curriculum. There's a number of curriculum characteristics we're working with, including local and global engagement, but research teaching links is one of the things that we want to hone in on. Allied to that is the support we're bringing to new programs and modules, because in a way, if you have a program that already delivers learning outcomes and gets students from A to B, revisiting that and integrating more research teaching links therein is a more complex process than if you're involved in programs and modules as they're conceived from the outset. Because the advantage that gives you is you can look at ways of building in these curriculum characteristics into provision in the first place. We're currently working with a master's degree in global leadership as part of college's emerging internationalization strategy. And it's proving to be a very effective way to get those links and make sure they're bedded in at the ground up so they become part of the fabric and structure of the program from the beginning. And something else we're working on is publications. John will present his work shortly, and that was one of a number of articles that individual students produced from different schools that all form part of one journal. One of the many interesting things that came out of that journal is students' perception of research teaching links. So one of Paul's last comments was saying to students, what's it like being in this great research-led university? And students genuinely being incredulous as to the fact that it was one. That's simply not reflecting their quotidian experience. And we found in the work we put together that there is a space between what schools say they provide and what students say they experience. And I think that space gives us an interesting space to work in, so that we can ensure that students experience and know they're experiencing strong research teaching links in their provision. We're also working on other publications, including a user's guide to curriculum characteristics, with the emphasis on making it practical and synoptic so that it can be a working document that people can use to revisit their own curricula. That should be available in June. Pleasingly, again, Paul mentioned at the beginning that medicine tends to come off better than most disciplines in this regard. And one of the things we did last year was curriculum benchmarking, where we took the curriculum characteristics that we'd isolated and then visited all the schools via the learning and teaching coordinators like Helen to see what's provided. And medicine does well at King's. You have the newly started CARS, you have Research Stars lecture series. So it's pleasing to note from the School of Medicine's point of view that bringing research and research activity to the student body is something that medicine does comparatively well when we look at all of the schools at King's. So taking Paul's kind of theoritized understanding of research and teaching and then looking more closely at what King's does, we're left with a number of questions to consider, some of which are about design. Do we design our programs and modules in a way that integrates research? Critically, about the point about what students experience, how do they come into contact with research? Or is that something that occurs at a stage removed from them? And then if we want students to be more active, learn actively, learn like researchers, what do we do to support that? Do we encourage students to learn about research methodology and research technique? And then if we do that, what opportunity do we give to them to put it into practice? There's words there like self-directed, and part of what we understand by university education is that we support people to become autonomous and self-directed learners. But then what opportunities do we provide for them to practice autonomy and self-direction as learners? And then another thing that we tend to find with research is it's often weighted towards the second half, or possibly even the final third, of a student's learning journey. Is there a case for rethinking that model and creating more opportunities for research much earlier in the process? Those are the contact details for Paul and I, and we'll also be around after this presentation's over. And thanks very much, and it's John.
Whilst you're putting that on, John, I'll just a short presentation about John, a little bit of background. John is a GPEP student, and before he became a GPEP student, he was at Oxford reading, very interesting, ancient history and classical archaeology. It's good that you've survived the GPEP course. He's now in his final year. I did have the honour of having John as my medical student in general practice a couple of years ago, and he was a very good student. So there we are. What better credential?
Thanks very much. So I investigated research teaching links in the Undergraduate School of Medicine, and particularly looked at whether encouraging students to take ownership of their education could sort of better the outcome and provide us a more holistic experience. So I'll quickly talk about how the interviews were conducted. And there are two recurring themes that I identified throughout the interviews. Firstly, there was some mismatch between institutional aims and what the students want to get out of the course. And secondly, the interviewees stressed that they want to see students take more ownership of their education. So I'll look at whether research teaching links can be used as a tool for promoting this ownership, and whether these research teaching links are pervasive in the learning environments throughout King's. So I interviewed 9 members of the undergraduate faculty, 3 senior researchers who were sort of heads of research divisions, 3 academics with senior teaching roles, so they focused more on their teaching, but they also had some academic research interests as well. And I was also asked to interview 3 graduate teaching assistants, but that entity doesn't exist within the Undergraduate School of Medicine. So I interviewed 3 foundation year doctors who are in their 2nd year. So they have an academic interest and a teaching interest as well. So we used a structured interview, and the interview focused on 2 aspects of academic life, research and teaching, unsurprisingly. And the 2 parts of the interview largely mirrored each other. So I asked about research and teaching experience, how they developed as both a researcher and a teacher, the methods and principles that you used to guide their teaching or research, and the motivation behind that. And also their views on student participation within the research sphere and how it influenced their teaching. So as I mentioned, there were 2 recurring themes. Both institutional aims and student objectives didn't seem to tally, and people would like to see students take more ownership of their education. So these are the King's School of Medicine aims. These are taken from the website, from the virtual campus. And largely the aim is to produce a well-rounded, competent doctor who has high standards of clinical practice and patient care, but also can develop a good working relationship with colleagues, patients, and aware of their ethical obligations as well. And it was well put by SR1 that he was just trying to make sure the students are going to be good doctors. That was his guiding principle in teaching. And this is done by using a spiral and progressive curriculum. So rather than throw tons of information at the student, this is sort of leaked gradually over the years, and this is used to build up a good foundation which they can build on throughout their undergraduate course and also as a junior doctor. But when asked about student objectives, or when interviewees talked about student objectives, they seemed to differ somewhat to this. And it seemed that students were very focused on passing exams. A GTA mentioned there's nothing deeper than that. And a senior teacher mentioned that sort of students had expressed this, and they were just very concerned about what they could do to pass exams rather than how they could become a competent medical professional. And this disjunction is largely recognised by the literature. Ransden suggests it's possibly to do with naivety of the student coming out of a very exam-focused secondary education and being put into a higher education. They're unaware of the sort of process of learning. And also could be due to, according to Clinton, a new commercial dynamic between higher education institutions and the student, whether the student sees themselves as a consumer and the university as a provider of a professional qualification. And Elton suggests there are 3 facets of student education. The first is self-interest in passing exams. He says we shouldn't overlook that. That's an important part of any student's education. But they'll largely take care of that themselves. The important points to emphasize are, or the important things to develop in a student is their interest in the subject and interest in developing abilities and tools they can use after university once they've graduated. And the idea is that if we encourage students to take more ownership of their education, these last 2 points might occur naturally. And ownership's a concept that's very important in research. Anybody who feels they've got responsibility in their project will tend to invest more time and energy into it. And I think that approach is transferable to students. And this was stressed throughout the interview. Sorry, I'm going backwards now.
Can you just have a slightly longer for that?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, if you need time to read that. Okay. So how can we encourage students to take ownership of their education? One idea is to use research teaching links as a tool for promoting this. It increases participation beyond the undergraduate course. They feel they're part of a wider university community. It promotes inquiry-based learning, equips students with the tools to pursue their own interests and ask their own questions. And it also breaks down hierarchical structures. So again, they feel that they're sort of equal within a research active community rather than isolated in an undergraduate course. So this is a model that's used to look at how research is taught throughout a course. And the axis on the y-axis is focuses on whether the student is a participant or a passive audience member. And the x-axis focuses on whether the focus of the teaching is on research processes or research content that's going on throughout the university. And it's argued that any course should have a mixture of all this and not any in total isolation. So if it's a research tutored exercise, then the students are participants and they're focusing on the content of the research. If it's research based, they're undertaking research inquiries, so they're both participants and learning about the processes of undertaking research. Research orientated, they're learning about how research is undertaken, the processes involved, but aren't participants. And research-led is where a student is an audience member, but simply learning about content. And that's largely sort of seen in lecture halls. So I'll now look at current practice at King's and where, from the interviews, I could identify that research content is taking place. And I identified 4 formal teaching environments that interviewees mentioned. There were lectures, seminars, bedside teaching, hospital exposure, and SSCs, which stands for Student Selected Components. So lectures are a good environment to introduce research, and lecturers were keen to do so. And they were keen to make it interactive and engage students in this. But they often found that lectures are sort of prescriptive, curriculum-driven environments where they have to fulfill certain objectives. And it's also in a pressured time slot. So they found it hard to introduce research content, especially when students are very keen on hitting the exam points rather than sort of learning about research content. But obviously it has the potential to be a research-led environment. Seminars offer arena for open discussion, and traditionally they're a very good research tutor environment where a teacher acts as a facilitator and guides the student through research processes and content. But in practice, a lot of the interviewees suggest that actually they don't work because at the moment there are too many students in the seminars. Some of them are sort of 30 students strong, and actually it turns into a lecture. So bedside teaching and ward exposure is a student favourite, and I think it's good because it's extremely immersive for the students, so they understand what it is to be a doctor, and they can put themselves in the doctor's shoes. And it's largely focused on developing clinical knowledge, examination skills, communication skills, and management approaches. And for this reason, there's little research content in bedside teaching. But it's an extremely good model for teaching students. And I wondered if that was a good model that could be transferred to a research focus environment and used for lab-side teaching or new research-based sessions. Student-selected components are generally the gold standard of research-focused teaching in King's, and they're excellent for offering students an experience of research within King's. So they can choose whatever they'd like to focus on, and it's offered very early on. And this is all-encompassing. It's research-led, tutored, orientated, and based. And it equips students with a great array of tools that they can use both at King's and beyond that. And again, this comes back to the curriculum being spiral. This is because it's repeated throughout the years. This is a research knowledge base that's built up on over the 5 years at King's. The interviewees suggest that perhaps this is more an isolated example in the wider curriculum. Some said that didactic teaching is more the name of the game. And students have said in the past that perhaps they'd like an opportunity for more open-ended inquiry. I think there are a few obstacles to promoting research-focused teaching for students. Specifically, a lot of the senior researchers were unsure of students' ability to cope with research. But I wonder if actually we should be focusing less on the outcomes of student research and more on the processes that puts them through. And secondly, there's the problem of opportunity and resources. Obviously, it's a big medical school, and there's the issue of how much time everyone has and how much money there is to promote this. So in conclusion, research teaching links promoting research teaching links is a great opportunity to encourage students to take ownership of their education. And SSEs already stand out as an excellent example of that. But I wonder if at the moment we're sort of too focused on research outcomes and whether we should look more towards putting students through the processes instead. And whether there are opportunities in existing structures to promote more research teaching, such as lab-side teaching. I think that's it.
Thank you very much, John. That was very clearly presented. Well done. So now, how do I get mine on? Oh, yes. After listening to this, John had sent me the results of his findings earlier. I thought, well, let me just see what we should be doing, because the medical course, the MBBS programme, has to deliver the learning outcomes that are stated in Tomorrow's Doctors, and the last edition was 2009. So the medical school gets assessed on how compliant we are with those learning outcomes. So I went back to Tomorrow's Doctors to see what it was the GMC said about research and science. And in the three outcomes of doctors, one is the doctor as a scholar and scientist, and one of the paragraphs there said that they should be able to explain the scientific basis for common disease presentations, which means really they need to be exposed to science teaching, to a scientific approach to be able to do that. And then linking it with the clinical, they must be able to make accurate observations of clinical phenomena and appropriate critical analysis of clinical data, which also comes from a research-based training. How do I get that progressed? On which keyboard? This one? This one?
Random if I
Oh,
may.
right. Yeah, okay, one keyboard I was.
Try that middle button there.
I did try that one. Oh, there we are. Yes. And the second area was paragraph 12, on applying scientific method and approaches to medical research. And there are 4 sections to this, to be able to critically appraise results of relevant diagnostic, prognostic and treatment trials and other qualitative and quantitative studies as reported in the medical and scientific literature. And that sort of goes back to the student-selected components and the library projects. Secondly, to be able to formulate simple, relevant research questions in biomedical science, psychosocial science or population science, or experiments to address the questions. So we don't need to make it all laboratory research. It can be human research and population research as well. Then apply the findings from the literature to answer questions raised by specific clinical problems, and then understand the ethical and governance issues raised in research. So there are a lot of areas there, and the question is whether we actually cover those in what we present. Detailed requirements and context, I found this as well, that the student should be learning in an environment that is committed to care based on evidence and research. Can help medical students understand the importance of developing research and audit skills to improve their practice, and that's another area we're not actually making it compulsory yet for the students to undertake an audit. That is an offer in student selected components. And then help to make sure that those responsible for their learning are aware of current developments in clinical theory and practice. In other words, that the teachers are up to date as well on the latest research. So some of you will know the heads of years. I then emailed the heads of years and said, right, what do you do that fits in with these learning outcomes? And this was the reply. So years 1 and 2, there's a lot of research basis in the scenario-based lectures and workshops, plus the scientific basis and evidence-based medicine. So year 1 and 2 felt they delivered that in addition to the student-selected components. In years 3, 4 and 5, or phases 3, 4 and 5, there is much less formal teaching, and so the scientific basis in the formal teaching comes in year 3 into the pathology pharmacology module. In year 4 there is some in the weekly symposia, which of course there were 3 simultaneous symposia. And I think I probably got this wrong. In phase 5, I wasn't clear, Richard, whether the GP project on evidence-based medicine and changing health behaviour, is that 4 or 5? And it's developed by Anne Wiley, it's a new...
Yes, it runs from
4 into 5, so it's both. So we already have, in the everyday medicine, we do have some signs, but do we have enough? The informal clinical teaching, which is difficult to measure, ward-based teaching, to what extent do the teachers bring in evidence-based medicine, as John emphasised? The SSCs we have. Then we also have, and that hasn't been mentioned yet, the intercalated BSc option to be able, so students can take a year out to undertake research and get a BSc at the end of it. And most of those intercalate between the 2nd and the 3rd year. Then we have the student-initiated groups, as John, was it John? No, as Michael and Paul mentioned, we have the Research Society and the STARS lectures. And recently we've had some peer teaching initiatives where students have encouraged other students to undertake research projects on medical education. So which is a sort of leadership role, really, in that. Okay, so I won't go into the student-selected components because I think it's more important to have a discussion. So I thought now we could have questions and discussion. I wonder if the speakers could come onto the stage. That would be helpful. We need to bring a chair, wouldn't we? And then we can direct the questions. There's one here. Here on that microphone. And I'll stand, yes. Okay, so, in fact, I thought one of the most interesting overheads was Paul's map, that which you were a little bit rude about because you said it was a strange map with outcomes, process, and what was the first one? Ideas?
There's the tools.
The tools, that's right.
And then there's the context.
Yes, and in fact, what we deliver in our curriculum fits into those slots quite neatly. And the question is whether there's a good balance between the two. So let's open this up to the audience and see what your views are. Or first of all, if you have any questions. Anne.
I suppose it's more a comment really, but thank you all for the presentation. And I think in my area, so I'm hot off the press by the way from a full day of literacy teaching to our GP teaching.
Yes. Yes.
There are students involved in it. And that's an example of where things are changing because nice guidelines come in and various new things come. And your teaching has to change. And you have to change how the teachers do the teaching as well. And it's a very intense and dynamic process to keep on top of it. So it's a comment really that I think we are doing this, or certainly trying to, the research being really explicit in process. But I imagine some of us have got so much teaching to do throughout 5 years that probably every session we do isn't quite as up to date as it could be. Recent stuff, but the students are a great resource as well, actually helping us be on top of our teaching, though it is current.
So I suppose the question is how we get these teachers to change. I'm reminded of my daughter's a doctor and she studied here, and on her elective she went to Chicago, she went to Cook County to study trauma, which worried me stiff. But anyway, when she came out she said, "Mum, it's amazing there, because everything they teach you in the accident and emergency department is backed up with evidence." And it's amazing because here we don't have it, you see. So in America it may be the litigation culture, but there's obviously a different approach there, and we haven't really developed that to the same extent here. Ron?
I'd just like to comment that John, of course, didn't do an integrated degree, but if you do an integrated degree, the vast majority of students will do a research project
Yes.
in that degree, and that counts 3/8 of their credits for that year. And in my experience, that's the point where one really has the opportunity, in terms of scientific, rather than medical, particularly scientific research, to introduce a student in depth to the process of scientific inquiry, gathering basis for planning experiments, executing and interpreting the data and so on, and actually interacting with students on a one-to-one
Yes,
basis.
the one-to-one.
And that's, I mean, I don't know whether any students here have done integrated degrees and research projects, but that's really one focus. And the other thing is that one of the things is that we have so much information to deliver, certainly in the first 2 years, that often we never get to discuss how we've reached that understanding, and that maybe at some point we could build in 1 or 2 lectures where we talk about how we know, how we know where we are.
How we reach that point.
Exactly, because one of the things that students, I think, strikes students when they do a research project is just how much work you need to do to get what's the equivalent of half a sentence in a standard textbook.
Yes.
And that's something that's very difficult to appreciate when you have a 45, 50-minute lecture, but actually to understand the degree to which that is based on thousands of hours.
One paper produces one statement
in
a textbook.
And we don't teach that.
The point you make, Ron, is quite interesting because it's a relatively unique experience. John pointed out, or somebody pointed out, that typically in an undergraduate curriculum, Paul probably said it, you do your research project at the end, final years. Integrated BSc student, typically between years 2 and 3, they then got another 2 years, 3 years, clinical years, in which they could be applying the insight they've got from doing the research project. Has anybody looked to see whether the student experience of learning in the clinical years is different for those students who've done an integrated project?
Yes. One of the students did a survey. It's only a small number of students, about 15, and to say whether it changed the way that they looked at their clinical work, having done a research project. And the answer was yes, it did. It changed the way they thought about it. It was a very simple study. I don't think it's been accepted for Amy, but on a large scale, I'm not aware that anyone's done that. Anne.
That's really interesting. I think that the way education is moving will be very different, say, in 10 or 20 years. I mean, when universities first started, people would just read their books to the students, and the students would write down their book. And now information is readily available. You can get it anywhere. So it's really boring. I found it really boring as a medical student, just learning information that was readily available. I really wanted it to actually question things, be curious, do research as part of my training.
And inquiry-based learning.
Yes, and I feel like that probably is where we're moving. We're just a bit slower.
It seems to be easier to do that when we have developed the e-learning programs. They are a little more inquiry-based, aren't they, than rather than didactic and in chunks of knowledge. Paul, do you want to
Just
comment on
a
that?
good comment on that. I think when you talk to academic staff about why they don't get into this, the main problem that comes back is content, the tyranny of the amount of content, particularly in areas like physics, which gets bigger and bigger every year and refuses to divide. And people feel that they can't do anything else but deliver it. And you've got to, at some point, make that decision that you are not going to deliver so much content. It's the argument that's been made about problem-based learning over many years, which obviously medicine had a great deal to do with. You've got to fundamentally decide you are not going to tell it all. So until you take that decision, you'll never have space. I absolutely agree. You've got to give people the opportunity to see the process of research being unpacked. I think researchers talking about doing research and actually walking the talk is so instructive, because most of the time we just show people the finished product of research. And that's quite over-facing sometimes. It's not a bad idea to show people half-done research, possibly even half-baked research, but just to show that it's done by humans who make mistakes. It's a very human process.
Any comments from the other members of the team on that?
Yeah, just one. I think it is the tyranny of content point. It's the comments coming from the floor that on this programme, the content is so voluminous that it dictates the learning and teaching strategy, particularly in the first couple of years. If we were to think, therefore, about, at the beginning of a programme, working on this learning as a researcher paradigm, and therefore the early stages are about giving students the critical armoury to work with content in less passive ways, that we then find the way they navigated through the content was more efficient, so that you have to then make it less content heavy in those first couple of years. If not a leap of faith, that's probably a step of faith, but I thought the really interesting point was about the intercalated degree. If you could look at the people who've done that and shown that people who had had that experience were more efficient learners thereafter, you then generate the evidence base to rethink the pedagogy. Because I think at the moment it is exactly the tyranny of content. You've got such a voluminous programme here that it is dictating the learning and teaching strategy, and I think that is problematic and worthy of rethinking.
That sounds like a good research project for one of our FY2s. Which was next?
This is really interesting. I love the idea that we have to look at the inspirational effect of personalities that students are exposed to, because I think motivational and inspirational things we often miss. I wanted to make a point about assessment and about the strategic approach that so many of our learners have. In medicine, in the last 15 years or more, a lot of our formal assessment methodologies have been driven with the sort of goal of high reliability, and we've used assessment methodologies that are highly automated and very reliable, and they are therefore often not particularly good at looking at thinking process. They're good at recognizing the right answer, but not whether the way in which you arrived at that right answer was a healthy one. And so I think this, for me, this seems to be an important component of the student wanting to know what the right answer is all the time. And I just wonder whether, if we're really going to look at trying to develop healthy thinking processes, critical thinking processes in our students, we don't have to actually think also very imaginatively and perhaps bravely about some of our assessment methodologies, and about whether we can find a way of assessing those things in students. If we don't assess them, I suspect quite a large number of our students simply won't learn them.
Any response to that? What do you think about assessment methods in the project?
Well, I think from what I can gather, I think largely because students have set these sort of targets at the beginning of the year, there are a lot of things they have to get assigned, a lot of objectives they have to meet. That becomes the focus of their learning goals rather than sort of looking at the course as a whole and saying.
It's highly concretized and highly atomized, and they're all little factoids, aren't they?
Yeah.
Little items, rather than an assemblage of items or an arrangement of items that makes sense.
I think it's also made harder by the fact that there are a lot of revision aids that set out the undergraduate course like that, and you just learn the facts and you can sign up for a subscription and answer some multiple choice questions. And students will see that as a way through the course and fail to notice that there's stuff around them, such as the research environment.
I think our front row. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Jonah.
Jonah. Well, yes, your question.
I was just going to say, you made a point in your talk that we don't have a lot. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the student. I think nothing to do.
And indeed, BSc.
But you made the point that we don't have a lot of content in our course, which is about looking at the process of inquiry. And you kind of suggested that we have some of that when we do the things online. Now, you made the point about the bedside teaching is quite formulaic. We learn to think in a particular way. Similarly, with the way the exam questions are structured, we're conditioned to think in a particular way, which is not necessarily terribly natural. And I don't think that it engenders the spirit of inquiry or understanding of the methods of inquiry. And I think, I don't know what you think about that.
What? Yes, you were mentioning the numbers in tutorial groups, and does that?
And that makes it hard because it really just turns into a lecture and you can't enter into a discussion with 30 people. It's very difficult. I think the bedside teaching thing is interesting. It's actually, I'd argue, that does expose students to the process of sort of investigating a patient. And it's less about the outcome of bedside teaching, it's more about understanding how you go about sort of taking history, investigating the process involved in speaking to patients and managing, which is why I think students enjoy it so much, is because they get to take part in that. It's less of a fact learning, it's more sort of taking part in these processes. So, that's why I wondered if that sort of environment could be transplanted into a lab for sort of an hour session and join a researcher and understand what they're doing and talk about it with only 3 or 4 people.
So what I meant was you're using the outcomes of research there, but that approach doesn't actually engender the spirit. It's not the same spirit of inquiry, which applies to research. You're learning how to apply lists of factoids in a way which is specific to that context.
Yes. Is that not teaching approach actually something we ought to be developing in the staff, because it's easy to switch into that mode, say, I'm prescribing this, or I've made this diagnosis, and then managing the patient this way. Right, what is the evidence? Will you go away and look it up and come back next week and tell me what the evidence was for me managing it that way or prescribing this medication? That's easy to do if you've only got a couple of students. If you've got about 8, 10 in a group, it is a bit difficult. Will they do it?
And certainly a lot of people suggest that, but I think
yes, but that's the way to do it. Continuity of teaching. Anne, you're next.
Three little things. One is that we need to encourage students to live with uncertainty right from the beginning. Well, we don't have any evidence. What is the evidence? There's so much little certainty. I think students feel uncomfortable, they want answers. We've got to say that often aren't answers. Secondly, to teach them to be self-directed. So we don't have to say, go and look at the evidence. I'm thinking, why? What's the difference between fetal hemoglobin? And I'm a curious person. And I'm going away and thinking out because it's what I'm interested in. And there was a third one. Oh yes, research with a big R. It's very frightening. It's about huge labs, lots of multi-millions, competition, being the best, and it puts people off. But actually, we're not really talking about research. We're talking about being curious, inquiry, little questions. Just a way of being rather than the big R.
So John's hierarchical, so overcoming hierarchical structures, which what a BSc possibly does, because it makes them feel part of a team rather than being outside the big research building. Do you think we actually overcome that with the integrated BSc?
Maybe. I think it's just a way of being, really. It's a culture of an school or a college, the way that we are as curious beings, and by giving just saying this is about facts and about regurgitating facts, we're actually de-skilling students.
So, Paul and Mike, how could we address that? What's it look like to you from the outside?
I had a lot of sympathy with your point, because research, we have to rely on how many
very off-putting to students. So you're really trying to get people to think of it in a much more small scale, but it's a habit of mind, if you like. It's a natural way of relating to the rest of the world, and maybe creating that specifically is a bad thing to do. Because there's so much kind of political capital in universities invested in thinking up research, and it doesn't help. It actually freezes people out of it, and research should be something everybody thinks is part of being alive, actually. That sounds pretentious, but I think it's right.
Well, it's researching uncertainty, isn't it? You have to start with uncertainty if you're going to do any research. You don't know the answer.
Somebody else is the point about instead of thinking the big R research, encouraging people to be curious. I suspect students probably are. You know, I think they probably come in being very willing to be curious, but then to come back to an earlier point, if content is tyrannical, assessment is even more so. And I think if we structure assessments that rely on the reproduction of knowledge, we can't really be surprised if students learn that way. And I think really, yeah, I actually start with a positive view of students. I think they are curious and they come in curious and they want to be curious. But it's a truism to say that the way we structure learning is going to direct the learning that happens. And maybe the big R research, particularly in fields such as medicine, as opposed to arts and humanities, is deeply intimidating and hugely competitive. But I think we can do things to encourage curiosity, not least because I think students are curious.
And we've got time for maybe one more question. Who's that? Down, Helen. Helen's here.
I teach maybe year 4 graduates in Bedside, and I'm often struck by the fact that we've got perhaps people are naturally more towards one way than the other, though I do believe we're all going with medicine curious as we would not be seeking it as a profession, probably. But there was certainly a more apprenticeship-driven group of students and a more questioning type of students. But at the basis of the beginnings more curious. But I think one of the things that goes sometimes wrong in medical school, in my experience of teaching in year 4, is that students may be attached to doctors who are more apprenticeship driven or more research, and that there's enough mixing of the two. And whereas that you might have the click of the doctor who's the apprentice teacher with the apprentice student, that might work very well. But you're not having enough mixing over. And the more academic group of doctors like myself who've got an academic background are often finding that they're having to teach apprenticeship way because they simply haven't got time to teach the research way as well. And the doctors who do not have an academic background are only teaching the skills of being a practical doctor. And there needs to be mixing, I think, in year 4, for example. It would be actually quite easy to take groups of students and say, this is your bedside tutorial, these are your seminars, these are your symposiums, and this is your experience of a lab, which is basically just cooking anyway. It's not even very frightening. When you come down to it, you follow a recipe and you get from A to B to C, and these questions as you go. But we're so busy dealing with different types of students, different types of doctors, but only one outcome, which is to make them practical doctor who can pass exams, to then go their own way, to then mix it all up. But I think there is enough experience there to do that. And certainly there's enough interest in students to do that. I think nearly every student would be delighted to go and mix up a little PCR tube. I'm sure they would do. It's exciting, so there's much fun to take a project.
So I suppose should we actually reduce the content a bit more and give the students more opportunity to have the odd day in the lab? Okay, it's past now, so we have some good questions and some excellent presentations. So can I thank you all formally for your presentation, very stimulating and very thorough research, John, on your part, so congratulations. And applaud in the traditional way. At one point, that is, when we say we advertise ourselves as a research-rich university in the prospectus, do we explain what that means? So that the students coming in know what it is and have an understanding of what to expect. Might be worth looking at.
I think we've chosen the term so it means everything to everybody.
Ah, very politic reply. Okay, so if you'd like to go through now for wine and nibbles.